The briefing room buzzed with voices and laughter as soldiers gathered around the large table, and screens flashed with mission details, and no one noticed the girl sitting quietly at the edge, her uniform clean, but empty of medals, her eyes sharp but always down. She was not part of the noise or the jokes. She was just there because someone assigned her a seat. Her name was Zara, and her file was one of many stacked high in the command office, ignored, unread, and forgotten, because she never spoke, never argued, never asked for the field. Her role was simple: data review, intel support, background noise in a room full of proud warriors. But this mission felt different, and even though she stayed still, her fingers trembled slightly under the table, because the moment the map appeared on the screen, she knew the place, every hill, every broken road, every hidden path. She knew the way the wind moved through those ruins, because she had been there long ago, when the sky was red and the ground burned. The commander pointed at the screen and said, "This mission is high risk, deep into hostile zone. We lost contact with a scout team near this location 3 days ago. Enemy movement is strong, but our best chance is now." And the soldiers leaned in with excitement and questions, ready to prove themselves again. Zara stared at the blinking red dot on the map, her breath slow, her lips parted. But no words came, because she knew that place had not changed, not really, not in the ways that mattered. She could still hear the cries that echoed through the smoke. She could still smell the fires that never went out, and the codes they now used were the same ones she once scratched into cold metal walls as a child. Across the table, one young soldier made a joke about the enemy being lazy, about how easy this mission would be, and the others laughed and nodded. But Zara watched the lines on the screen move in patterns, too perfect, too familiar, like someone was copying a story already written, and that story was hers. No one asked for her thoughts, no one cared that she kept looking at the screen with fear in her eyes and memory in her blood. And when the meeting ended, she stood slowly and walked out alone while the others prepared for battle, cheering each other and shining their weapons like this was just another day of glory. Back in her small room, she opened the old tablet hidden in her bag, the one she was never supposed to keep, and she typed the names she saw on the mission board, the locations, the enemy signs, the codes, the call signs, and one by one the screen lit up with matches, all of it linked to one thing: her file. Her file had been written long ago by a doctor who never smiled and a soldier who always smelled like smoke. They had recorded everything: her age, her trauma, her memories, the games they made her play in those labs. Far away, they called her Echo, because she never spoke, and everything she did was a reflection of what they forced her to become. That file had been buried when the labs fell, and she was moved to a safe zone, reclassified and forgotten until now, when somehow the world outside began to follow the same path, the same missions, the same signs, like someone had taken her file and made it a map. The door to her room opened without a knock, and an officer stepped in, his face tight with fear. He held a data pad and said, "I opened your file. I don't know why, I just did, and I think we have a problem." And Zara looked at him, her face pale but calm, and she whispered, "It's happening again." He showed her the data. He found mission after mission echoing her past. Even the names of enemy commanders matched the false names from her childhood games. And now the missions were real, the people were dying, and she was the only one who knew the full picture. He asked, "Why didn't you say anything?" And she said, "No one ever asked, no one ever believed. And now it's too late, because they're already inside the lines, already walking into the trap I once walked into as a child." He said, "We have to tell command," but Zara shook her head and said, "They won't listen. Unless someone dies, they never listen." And they never read the file, because it was written by a ghost, and ghosts don't matter until they haunt someone. Outside the base, the dropship engines roared as the team boarded, ready for battle, ready to prove themselves. And Zara watched them through the window, her hands pressed to the glass, her heart racing not with fear, but with something deeper: the weight of knowing too much and the pain of being silent for too long. She turned back to the officer and said, "Give me a chance to speak to them. If they hear it from me, maybe they'll see the truth. Maybe they'll see the echoes before they become screams again." And he nodded, not fully understanding, but knowing something had changed, something cold and old was now rising again. And so Zara prepared to speak, not with reports, not with numbers, but with her voice for the first time since she was a child, because this mission wasn't new, it was a memory being played again. And this time, she would not let them walk into it blind again. The dropship door closed with a heavy sound, and the engines hummed louder as the squad inside checked weapons, strapped armor, and laughed like it was just another day in the field. And no one noticed Zara, sitting quiet near the back, her hands gripping the seat, as if she could feel the ground pulling her back. Captain Rel walked past her, giving her a short nod. He had heard she was joining the mission, last minute, some kind of special approval from above, and he didn't argue. He had seen strange things in war, but nothing stranger than the girl, with no rank, sitting on his flight. The sky turned red as they flew over the scorched valley, and Zara's eyes stayed locked on the window. Every twist of the river, every line in the rock, all of it was the same. Nothing had changed since she escaped that place, not the land, not the silence, not the danger waiting behind the wind. She remembered the old outpost they were going to. It had been her prison, and her playground, a place of games and tests and whispers in the night. And now command said it was just an enemy hideout. But she knew better. She had lived there when her name was not Zara, but Subject 23, and the walls knew her blood. The ship touched down hard, and dust flew everywhere, and the squad moved fast, scanning the area, setting up comms, and forming patrol groups, while Zara stood still on the edge of the landing zone, her eyes on the ruins beyond, where metal towers, bent like bones, and broken signs still hung on old wires. One soldier named Tai found a strange piece of metal half buried in the dirt, and called out with a laugh, saying it looked like a piece of a toy, but Zara saw it, and her breath caught in her throat, because it was not a toy, it was the handle of the music box they made her listen to during the test sessions, and it still had the crack she made when she threw it at the wall. She walked over and took it gently from his hand, and he raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, because something in her face made him step back without knowing why, and she held the piece close, and whispered name only. She remembered the name of the girl who shared that room with her long ago and never left. Captain Rel ordered the squad forward toward the inner buildings, and Zara followed, without speaking, her eyes scanning everything, and her heart beating harder, as the signs appeared one after another, painted marks on the walls, signals, left in code, just like in the stories from her file, and no one else noticed how perfect they matched. A drone flew ahead and showed heat signatures moving in patterns that made no sense to the others. But Zara saw the plan clear as glass. They were not just enemies hiding, they were forming a net, a trap made of the same tactics used in her training games meant to break a child and shape a weapon. She told Rel to stop the squad and explained what she saw, but he didn't believe her at first, not fully, not until they reached the door of the command post and found the words scratched into the metal, words from her own notebook. As a child, words no one else could know. He looked at her different after that and asked how she knew, and she said, I wrote it before they stole it, and now they are using it to hunt us. And he nodded slowly and said, then you lead, we follow. And she stepped inside, first with her hands shaking and her past crawling all over her skin. Inside the command post, the walls were black and the screens were broken, but something deeper waited in the dark, not people, not weapons, but memories hanging heavy like smoke. And Zara moved through it like a ghost, remembering every room, every sound, every scream that bounced through these halls when she was just a small girl with wide eyes and no voice. Tai found a console still working and pulled data from it, and the screen showed operation names that matched old entries from Zara's file, and missions they thought were random, now lined up like dominoes, each one using tactics from her past and timelines from her childhood, and it was all too clean to be a mistake. The squad stood silent as the truth settled around them like dust, thick and heavy and cold, and Zara looked at them and said, someone is using my life to plan these attacks, and if we don't stop them, they will keep going, they will keep building their war on the bones of my memory. And Rel stepped forward and said, then we tear it all down. And she nodded once, and for the first time in years, she felt like someone heard her, like her voice mattered, like the file no one read was finally being seen, not as a record, but as a warning. They moved deeper into the ruins, knowing now this was not a mission of attack or defense, but a journey into a nightmare built from a forgotten past, and only one person knew the way through, and she had been waiting for years to walk it again, this time not as a victim, but as the one who remembers everything. The base was quiet when they returned, the sun already sinking low and the wind carrying dust across the steel landing pad. And Zara stepped out first, her boots slow, her face pale but firm, and behind her the squad followed, without their usual jokes, without smiles, just silence, like they had walked through something none of them could explain. Inside the war room, the generals waited, eyes sharp and full of questions, and Zara stood in front of the table, not as a soldier, not as a guest, but as the center of a story no one wanted to believe until now. And the screen behind her showed everything they had found, every mark, every code, every mission, name taken from her file. General Thorne leaned forward and asked a question, not with anger, but with fear in his voice. He said, who are you really? And Zara looked at him, her hands tight by her side, her voice steady. as she said, "I am the girl they left behind, the one who was never supposed to come back." She told them about the camps hidden deep in the dead zones, places no one wanted to speak about, places where children were taken and used in tests and games and training. They called it survival prep, but it was never about survival. It was about control, about shaping minds and breaking wills. And Zara had been one of the first. They gave her numbers, not a name, and called her Echo, because she never spoke and never cried, and everything she did they recorded, everything she touched, they saved every scream, every choice, every mistake, and they used it all to train others, not to protect them, but to create the perfect model for obedience and fear. The missions now happening in the real world were not just copies of her memories. They were designed from them, structured around her pain, mapped by her old actions. And it meant someone still had access to the files, someone who knew the system and wanted to rebuild it from the ashes. One of the tech officers played a video file they pulled from enemy data, and it showed a simulation room shaped exactly like the ruin Zara had led them through. Even the symbols on the wall matched, and a voice in the video gave commands using the same call signs she remembered from her youth, and her hands shook as she heard them again after all these years. Ty stood beside her, the only one not afraid to meet her eyes, and said to the room, "She knew everything. Before we saw it, she let us out of that place like she had walked it yesterday. And she saved our lives, and maybe it is time we stop treating her like a broken record and start listening to the truth she carries." But not everyone agreed, and one officer said she could be compromised, she could be feeding us lies, or worse, she could be part of them. And Zara turned her head slowly and said, "If I was part of them, you would all be dead by now." And her voice made the room fall silent again. General Thorne finally spoke and said, "The truth is we failed her, we failed to read the file, we failed to believe the warnings, and now we face a war shaped by our own ignorance, and she may be our only chance to understand what is coming next." They moved her to a secure room, not as a prisoner, but as someone holding dangerous knowledge, and the lights were soft and the air still, but Zara sat in the dark, not sleeping, just thinking, remembering the others from the camp, the ones who never escaped, the ones whose screams never ended. And she wondered if any of them were still out there, used the same way she had been used. In the morning they gave her access to the old servers, and she searched fast and deep through data long buried and files marked lost. And she found names, dates, operations, all linked to the same hidden code, her original ID number burned into every secret line, and it meant someone inside the system had kept her alive, on paper long after she vanished from sight. She printed one page and handed it to General Thorne and said, "This is the next mission you planned. The location matches the last place I was taken before I escaped. And if they are using the full file, it means what happens next is worse than anything we have seen so far." And he looked at the paper and said, "How do you know?" And she said, "Because it is the part of my story I never told anyone, not even in the file." Everyone in the room turned toward her, as if they could feel the weight of that untold memory pressing through the air, and Zara closed her eyes and whispered, "I was not the only one they trained, but I was the only one who ran. And if the next mission matches what I remember, then they are not just repeating the past, they are bringing back the others, and I do not know what they became after I left." The wind howled outside the base, and the night felt too quiet, and inside the war room the girl, who had once been forgotten, now stood at the center of the storm, ready to face what waited in the dark, because she had survived it once, and this time she would not run again. The desert wind screamed across the cliffs, as the squad moved fast through the old canyons, guided by Zara, who now walked with sharp eyes and steady steps, her voice calm over the comms, telling them where to turn, where to pause, where the shadows meant danger, and every time she was right. Ty stayed close to her, watching her face as they moved, and he saw it change every time they reached another location. She remembered not from maps, but from pain and dreams that never stopped. And when they reached the ruins of an old bunker buried in dust and heat, Zara raised her hand and said, "Stop." Captain Rel gave the order, and the squad crouched behind the rocks, weapons ready. But what they saw next was not enemy movement or drones. It was a figure standing still near the bunker door, dressed in dark armor with marks that looked too clean, too perfect. And Zara stepped forward slowly, saying, "I know that uniform." The figure turned and raised both hands, empty of weapons, and said a name none of them knew except Zara, and her breath caught in her chest, because it was a name only one person ever called her, the name of the doctor who trained her in the old facility, the one who taught her to move without sound, to think like a machine, and to forget her name. She stepped closer, ignoring the captain's warning, and the figure spoke again, saying, "You survived longer than I thought." And she replied with anger, and hurt, saying, "I escaped you, and I buried every piece of your world." But he shook his head and said, "No, child, you never escaped. You are still playing your role just like we designed." Rel moved beside her now, weapon raised, and asked, "Who is this man?" And Zara said, "He was the one who wrote my file, the one who built the program, using my mind, using my pain." And he said she was the first to prototype, the one who made all the others possible. And they copied her every move to train soldiers faster, stronger, more loyal, and without fear. The man pulled out a small device and tossed it gently at her feet and said, "You should see it for yourself." And when Zara picked it up and pressed play, the small screen lit up with files and footage, all marked with her original ID number, and all of them showed new soldiers trained in her image, following her paths, mimicking her choices, and even wearing her face during simulations. The squad watched in horror as they realized what this meant. Their missions were not just matching her past, they were engineered from it. And someone was using her life to shape the battlefield, and Zara's voice broke as she said, "They didn't just steal my past, they are building their future on it." Ty grabbed the device and scrolled fast through the names and locations, and said, "This is every operation from the last 5 years, all matched with dates from her time in the facility." And Rel said, "How is that even possible?" And the man laughed softly, saying, "We never stopped the program, we just moved it deeper and made it smarter." Suddenly explosions rocked the canyon walls, and the man turned and ran, disappearing into smoke and dust, and drones dropped from the sky, firing shots. As the squad scrambled for cover, Zara grabbed a rifle and joined them, moving with a grace no one had seen before, not trained, but instinctual, like every step was already written into her bones. They fought hard and pushed back the drones, but not before one of the squad was wounded, and Zara dragged him behind cover, her hands steady as she patched him up, her mind racing not with fear, but with a dark truth sinking in deeper. With every breath, she had been the test, but now she was also the weapon. Back at the base, the tech teams worked around the clock, breaking into the device, and what they found froze the entire command center. The files showed not only missions, but predictions and future moves, all based on psychological models drawn from Zara's life. Every reaction, every fear, every decision mapped and projected into enemy strategy. General Thorne called her into the war room again, and this time he looked tired, older, like the weight of what they had done finally pressed against his chest. He said, "They used you to build an army, and now that army is moving." And Zara said, "They're not just moving, they are following the script, and the worst part of that script is still ahead." She pointed to a mission file marked Echo Terminal and said, "This was the final phase of my training, the one I never finished, because I escaped. And if they are following this, then they are about to activate the others, the ones who stayed behind, the ones they completed." Everyone stared at the screen where her face appeared over and over in different bodies, different lives. And General Thorne whispered, "What have we done?" And Zara stood still with her hands clenched and her eyes burning with fire, and said, "Now you see what happens when you ignore the file of a forgotten child who remembered everything." And the room went silent as the war they thought they understood began to show its true face, shaped not by politics or power, but by the stolen memories of a girl who had survived it all and now had no choice but to lead them into the storm she never asked for, but always knew would return. Night fell over the base, but no one slept, and the lights in the war room stayed on as Zara stood by the window, staring into the dark horizon where her past now marched forward, wearing new faces and old commands, and behind her the officers whispered about what to do next, but none of them dared raise their voice against her. Then the message came, not through command, not through secured channels, but through the emergency broadcast line, usually used only for disasters, and it was a voice soft and calm and too familiar. And it said, "Echo, you always ran, but you always listened." And Zara froze as the sound hit her like ice down her spine. The others looked at her, and General Thorne asked, "What does it mean?" But she said nothing at first, just reached slowly for the radio and turned up the volume. And the voice continued speaking, as if reading from a book, saying phrases that only she would understand, lines from her training sessions, her punishments, her dreams. It said, "The Ghost Command remembers you, and the blueprint still holds, and your steps are still watched, and we are almost ready." And then silence returned, but it was heavier than before, thick, with a weight no one could name, and Zara stepped away from the window, her face pale, but her eyes alive with something deeper than fear. She said, "They know I am active, and they want me to return." And the captain asked, "Return where?" And she said, "To the core, to the first place where they built the others, and shaped me, and called it success and failure both." And Rel said, "We will go with you." And Zara shook her head, saying, "No, this is not your war, not in the same way." But Tai stepped forward and said, "You told us the story, and now we are part of it, and we do not leave you alone, not now, not ever." And slowly the rest of the squad nodded, and General Thorne looked at her with a strange mix of pride and sorrow, and said, "Then go and finish it." They moved at dawn through a storm of wind and sand toward coordinates pulled from the enemy tablet Zara had found the week before, and every mile brought them closer to the truth, and every minute she remembered more things. She wished she could forget the voices, the mirrors, the drills that broke her spirit, and the cold hands that stitched her back together. The place was hidden beneath a mountain shielded by rocks and a false signal array, and they found the entrance just as the sun cracked the sky. And it looked like nothing at first, just a metal plate half buried. But when Zara placed her hand on it, the ground opened and revealed stairs leading down into the dark. Inside was quiet, no alarms, no lights, just the hum of machines that never stopped, and the air smelled like the past, like rust and bleach and fear. And as they walked, deeper lights flickered on by themselves, and cameras followed them. But no one spoke, because the deeper they went, the colder it became. They reached a central chamber shaped like a ring, and in the middle stood a terminal glowing with blue light, and on the screen was her name, not Zara, not Subject 23, but Echo, and the words, "Welcome back," and Tai whispered, "It feels like it was waiting for you," and she nodded, saying it was. Then the lights shifted, and a screen on the wall blinked alive, showing faces, one after another, all similar to hers, all marked with IDs and stats and labels like active, dormant, terminated. And one by one the faces turned to look at her, as if they could see through the screen, and one voice echoed through the room, saying, "Echo Prime, you are the first, and you are the last." A door opened, and out stepped a figure tall and slow-moving, dressed in the same armor as the man from the canyon, and had removed his helmet, and the face underneath was hers, almost exactly, older, colder, but the same, and Zara stepped back, her breath caught as the figure said, "I am what you were meant to be." It called itself Echo 9, and explained that the others had been activated years ago, quietly placed into government's army's fleets. And now they were all being called back under one signal, the Ghost Command, and they had one purpose, not peace, not conquest, but to reset the balance by removing all those who had shaped war through chaos. Zara said, "You were made from pain and lies, and you want to make the world pay for what happened to us." And Echo 9 said, "No, we want the world to never forget us again, and that means showing them what they created and what they lost when they let children like us be turned into ghosts." A countdown began on the terminal, and Zara realized they had triggered a final protocol, and she turned to Rel and said, "We need to stop it." And Echo 9 said, "You cannot stop a story already written." And Zara replied, "Then I will write a new one." With seconds left, Zara stepped forward and placed her hand on the core console, and the lights flared and the alarm screamed. And in that moment she saw every path, every face, every memory, and made one final choice to override the command with her own code, the one thing they had never expected. The screen froze, the countdown stopped, and the system asked one final question, voice authentication, and she whispered her true name, not Echo, not Subject 23, but the name her mother once called her, and the machine accepted it, and the lights shut down, leaving only silence and the sound of breath returning. Echo 9 vanished into the dark, and Zara stood alone at the console. And for the first time in years, she felt like herself again, not a weapon, not a file, not a ghost, but someone who had taken her story back with her own hands and her own voice, and the others followed her out without a word, because nothing needed to be said anymore. The base was quiet when they returned, and the dust still clung to their armor and boots, but no one spoke as the dropship lowered to the landing pad, and the wind howled softly like it knew something had changed, and inside Zara walked slowly, her hands by her side, and her eyes locked forward, not on the sky, not on the ground, but on the silence between them all. They passed through the gate, and the guards stared, not in confusion, but in awe, because word had already spread about what happened below the mountain, about the shutdown, about the Echo units that vanished about the moment when Zara spoke her real name and rewrote the end of a war designed by ghosts. Inside the command center, General Thorne waited alone, and when Zara entered, he stood up slowly and offered her a seat, but she did not take it. She walked to the center of the room and placed a small chip on the table, and said, "This is all that remains," and his hands trembled slightly as he picked it up and saw the data and understood. It was the root file of the Ghost Command, the original AI built from her memories, the core script of every Echo protocol, and the model they had used to train and deploy clones across the stars, and she had locked it with a voice code no one else could break, and now that voice had walked away from it forever. Thorn asked how and why and what comes next. But Zara only said I chose to be more than a pattern, and I ended the pattern, and what comes next is not mine to write. And she turned to leave but paused at the door and said I never wanted to be remembered as a weapon, but if I am, then let it be for the war. I stopped not the ones they made me fight. She left the room and walked outside where the sun had started to rise, golden light spilling over the hills and touching the tops of the towers like fire without heat, and the wind caught her hair and carried it behind her like a banner, and the squad stood waiting not because of orders, but because of respect and memory. Ty stepped forward and handed her the dog tag she had dropped during the last mission, and she looked at it quietly and said it never had my name anyway. And he smiled and said maybe now it should, and handed her a small plate freshly made, engraved with the name she had whispered in the heart of the enemy, based the name that finally set her free. They walked together toward the main square, and the others followed, moving, without formation, without commands, just a quiet trail of people who had seen something they could never forget, and the civilians at the edge of the base looked up and saw the girl who once had no voice now leading, without needing to speak. That night a message went out from Central Command, not a warning, not a call to war, but a declaration that the Ghost Command was dead and that the files tied to it would be sealed and erased, and the world would never again build armies from pain or shape weapons from the minds of children. But deep in the archives, one file was saved, marked Final Record, and it carried only a short note written by General Thorn himself. And it said her name was Zara. She was never trained, she was never trusted, she was never heard until it was almost too late. But she stopped a war built in her image and chose peace in a world that gave her none. The file was locked and stored in the memorial vault under the title Echo, Terminated, and the room it rested in was cold and quiet, with one light always burning above it, and on the wall a single line was carved by hand. She remembered everything, so we would not forget. Zara never returned to the field. She left the base a few days later, without fanfare, without guards, just a small pack, and her name finally her own, and she walked toward the edge of the horizon, not looking back, and not needing to, because she knew that this time she had not run, she had walked through the fire and come out free. And somewhere far away, in a quiet place, without screens or guns, she sat under the stars, and listened to the wind and the sounds of night, and for the first time in her life, she felt like no one was watching, no one was listening, no one was writing her every move. She closed her eyes and let herself breathe, not as echo, not as a file, not as a memory, but as a person, and in that breath, she finally found something they had never given her in all the years. She was used and lost. She found peace, and the world moved on. But the legend of the girl who stopped the war from inside the war never died, and in whispers and quiet stories soldiers told of the one who broke the chain, who silenced the command, who stood before her own shadow and said no more, and they called her by many names. But only one truly mattered, the one she gave herself, and the one history would never lose again, Zara.